To put Erwin Schulhoff in a greater context, we have to see where he fit into the 20th century and where does he fit in with many of the other composers who were suppressed by the Nazis. In the course of these 3 episodes, we're going to be taking each period and going into that in depth. And we'll call the first period Youth and Dada, the first suggestions of jazz, and then we'll go into the second period, which will be, broadly speaking, the 1920s, which will begin with experimentation first in 12-tone music, a very short experimentation, I should add, his discovery of his Czech roots, moving into a more developed relationship with jazz, and only toward the end of that, and really only slightly suggesting the future that will emerge in the final period, which for simplicity's sake we can call the Marxist period. Erwin Schulhoff was born in Prague in 1894 into a German-speaking family and culture. He was recognized, first of all, not surprisingly, by his mother to be a talented young musician. So at a very early age, maybe 4, maybe 6, I'm not sure, I don't remember any longer, he was brought to Antonín Dvořák, who of course was the god of Czech music at the time. And at that point it was said that Dvořák was old and grumpy and wasn't particularly pleased to see mothers with their young prodigies. But fortunately, and nevertheless, he accepted to meet him. He listened to him play the piano. He tested him out, music theory, his ear, and he judged that, yes, he was very talented, and he then opened that door to him to an education, which was very important. Schulhoff's years will see an education in Prague at first, Vienna subsequently, and then Cologne. He will be conscripted into the Austrian army. He will be wounded in the war. He will come out of the war embittered and angry at what he had seen, and this will be one of the major influences for the rest of his life. Later on in his life, when he was to embrace his Czech roots a little more strongly, he would begin to, first of all, find that depth in himself and also to bring these two cultures together. But he considered himself, and even said so, I write like an outsider looking in. And that's an important fact. Now, of course, he was Jewish. At that time, that wasn't yet the enormous problem to him that it was going to become later. He was influenced by, of course, all of his German teachers, but he was also very impressed with Strauss and Debussy. He was always a radical. He was always avant-garde. He was always rebellious. He was one of the bad boys of the, well, I'd have to say he's one of the bad boys of the post-First World War era. But that character was always there and was evident in his very short relationship with Debussy, whom he went to study with in Paris. And the story goes, he came, he took his first lesson, he was given homework, he came back at the assigned time, and he hadn't done anything Debussy had told him to, and Debussy said, well, you can't do that because it's parallel fifths, and you can't do this kind of voice leading because that's wrong. And he said, but you do it yourself. He said, yes, but I'm Claude Debussy. And that was the end of the relationship. The First World War changed everything in Europe. The political and national order was reshuffled. The end, particularly, of the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. But most of all, the change was from the younger generation who were actually in the war and had experienced it, came out disillusioned, embittered, for the very good reason that they had seen the senselessness and cruelty of the war and were now faced with constructing or reconstructing their lives along with everybody else based on nothing. And so there's a great urge, there's a great movement amongst artists, amongst writers, amongst composers to not continue the traditions that were existing before and into that war, but to challenge them, as if to say, well, those traditions produced this. They produced a war. That war is bad. We don't want to use those traditions because we want to reject them and we don't want it to happen again. Now, of course, there's not a cause and effect between writing classical music and the war, but in their mind, they wanted to say something new. They wanted to challenge the past. They wanted to mix it all up and start from somewhere else. So Erwin Schulhoff, of course, this is him from the very beginning of his compositional life, that it's not about what everybody else did. I want to bring music into places it hasn't been, and I want to let those places come into my music. The very first example of that are the Dadaist pieces. Now, Dada was a revolt that went around, well, in terms of language, well, we don't want to talk the way people have talked. We don't want the same sentence structure. We don't want what they called coherence. We want some of it to be aleatory and nonsense.
Seahorses and flying fish. Dressly, bestly, negaben, layla, flush, kata, bala, bash, zack, hitty, zap. Zack, hitty, zap. Hitty, betsley, push, kata, bala, bash, fash, kitty, bim. Zitty, catilla, bibilla, zicko, di, zacko, bam, fish, kitty, bish. Boombala, bamba, zitty, catilla, zack, hitty, zap. Boombala, bamba, zitty, catilla, zack, hitty, zap. Thressly, bestly, negaben, gru, bla, la, biola, bimini, bish, biola, bimini, fush, kata, bala, bash, zick, hitty, zap.
So in a different way, he was going to start to produce music in that vein. And so off he goes right away at the end of the war in finding alternative ways of making his point through his music. A direct example of Schulhoff's experience with the war is he was one of the first composers to write piano music for the left hand only. Of course, Ravel, Korngold would do the same as an homage in a certain way. It wasn't written specifically for Paul Wittgenstein, of course, was the greatest example of that, and Ravel wrote his concerto for that. But his mind was there, and that was one of the many things. To Schulhoff, it was a short jump. Piano music is always for two hands, so here's piano music for one hand.
Schulhoff, he can't always escape the darkness, I think, that existed in Europe. So in this left-hand suite, when we get to the final movement, and we start off with this sort of fun, almost type of dance, maybe Spanish dance of some kind. We think, oh, we're in for a treat, but no. This piece develops into what I think of as this roaring behemoth in many ways, and it becomes this unbridled force of nature that really, as a performer, I'm overwhelmed by it, and it's like I'm just hanging on for dear life. As that's a moment where I feel like Schulhoff he's like the conductor now, and I'm just trying to keep up. And a good composer makes me feel that way, when I feel like I'm almost a passenger on this piece that's just taking me somewhere that I would never be able to go without the score. All of these things, I would say, are what makes Schulhoff such a, again, complex, really intriguing person, as well as a composer, and you see that through his music.
Let's talk about Schulhoff and Dadaism. This is a movement, the big names associated with it: George Grosz, Otto Dix as a painter, and he becomes acquainted with it probably through his sister Viola, who was a painter. He goes to Dresden, he meets the crowd, and he starts applying that to his own compositions. And they're an interesting group of pieces. Some of the first pieces that come to mind: the Sinfonia Germanica, which is a short spoof on Deutschland, Deutschland über alles, and it is performed by a tenor screeching Deutschland, Deutschland über alles at the top of his lungs. A clear sarcasm, a clear irony on the war efforts and the patriotism that accompany them.
Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles, in
Another is Sonata Erotica for Muttertrompete, mother trumpet. It features a solo female voice, moans, groans of ecstasy in the course of an erotic encounter. That's all.
No. Oh, no. You, please. Oh, no. Please. Do be kind. Please.
Another piece that comes to mind is Bass Nachtigall, Bass Nightingale. This is a very humorous piece. The first piece of humor is nightingales don't usually express themselves in the bass register. But just as funny is the choice of the instrument, the contrabassoon. Now, there's absolutely nothing wrong with writing a solo for contrabassoon. It's just highly unusual. In fact, most people seem to react at first as, we're not accustomed to hearing a solo piece on a contrabassoon. And that's the point. Here he is again, stretching the limits and saying, well, you're not used to this? Here, take this. A piece in 3 movements, 3 short movements for the contrabassoon. Now, as it is with many of these funny pieces, it's preceded by a text. And Schulhoff, when he wrote, was a very gifted writer and hilariously funny and ironic and sarcastic at times. So this little text is going to show you at the same time a sort of step into the Dadaist world of nonsense and rejection of normal forms. And at the same time, you're going to get a little picture of who the person, Erwin Schulhoff, is.
If the divine spark may be found lurking even within a sausage, then why not the double bassoon? This is therefore dedicated to poetical friends and aesthetes. In short, to all hypersensitive souls as an experience. While others are swooning to the sweet tones of the violins, then take note, I always do the opposite. Just in order to provoke you. You petty marionettes, fops, bespectacled pseudo-intellectuals, you pathological hothouse plants, and decayed expressionists. I admit without any shame to have been created out of muck and to revel in muck. But you lot are already born with immaculately ironed creases in your white tie and tails. You who merely exist. In order to keep my distance from you all, I will take a firm grasp on my monocle, and I'll make you show me respect.
The Bass Nachtigall is a piece that was a little bit confusing to me at first, until I really got to know it. I thought it was interesting that it's sort of a mockery of the audience and sort of meant to, he was sort of thumbing his nose at the expressionist movement of the time. And it seems like he obviously had some sort of sense of humor. So I really appreciate that. And the fact that he included the epilogue at the end, I thought it's been really humorous to learn this piece and the intention behind it. And I'm discovering more intricacy, sort of the compositional techniques from a theory standpoint, how it all kind of is constructed and works together. The more familiar you are with the piece, the more you're able to really explore and take liberties and take chances and really kind of step outside of the box. So that's what I really enjoyed about learning this piece.
Now, as a last example, and my favorite of all, is a movement of silence to be found in the middle of a 5-movement, 5 sketches for piano. Now, why do I find that so amusing? First of all, we all speak about John Cage as having created this concept of silence in music. But in fact, Schulhoff did it before John Cage. And I think we're going to find other examples where Schulhoff was ahead of the curve and of everybody else, even though he's never credited with that or even recognized as having done so much. Now, half of the humor of this silent movement is to actually see the page of music. Many notations, meters, times, character marks, tempi, dynamics, it's all there. But it all adds up to what? Silence.
thing about Schulhoff that I love is that with his music, the way he writes it, the way he literally puts the ink on the paper, there's so much to unravel, there's so much to discover, and there's so many questions that arise out of it. And this is, for me, a sign of a good composer, when there's this ambiguity where you can have a discussion about what does this marking mean. He liked to almost have an open-ended adventure for the performer in the Pittoresken, the 5 Pittoresken that he wrote in 1919. These 5 pieces. The third movement is striking because it's one page of just pure silence. And this page of silence, at first you say, okay, well, I just sit there in silence. But then you look at the music and you say, well, he did write lots of different rests. He wrote all these markings. It's a smiley face right there. There's a frowny face. What does that mean? There's a breath mark. And as you keep on looking at this score, your brain just starts being activated. And that's what I love about him, is that he's always activating my imagination and my brain. And I would say that even I perform this piece of silence in a certain way. I interpret it a certain way, but I am sure that this will change over time. And I think that's a mark of a composer that I enjoy to play, a composer that I feel allows me to not only respect them and respect what they wrote, but also to have a bit of my own, my own take on it. And that's something that I just feel like it's a wonderful collaboration between composer, the ghost of a composer, and me on stage.
Just as Schulhoff was ahead of his time in creating a piece of silence, he was also going to be ahead of his time in being the first composer not to write in the jazz idiom, but to embrace it so thoroughly. He first became acquainted with jazz in nightclubs and bars, particularly in his years in Cologne. He said he preferred the bar to the rest of the city. Now, as a former resident of the city of Cologne, I think that's a little unfair to that wonderful city. But I understand, because this was him discovering himself. Jazz had been introduced in those years to Europe, and we'll talk about that more in the next episode. But he believed that jazz was the music of the future. And of course, he was correct. Jazz went on to conquer the world in a way that almost nothing else has before or maybe since. So he puts his heart into that, and he wants to eventually marry jazz with classical music, and he's going to do it in a very unique way.